reasoning. Oh, there you go. Reasoning behind the work that we do. It's not always easy to tell this story. The infrastructures and the systems that are in place are often quite hidden and complex. So Phil's rigorous research is crucial when it comes to understanding that bigger picture. So Phil is a professor at Michigan State University in the US and a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. His visualizations of food system changes, particularly trends of consolidation in food and agricultural industries, have been featured in numerous media outlets and cited by policymakers both in the US and in the EU. So tonight, focusing on seeds, bread, and beer, Phil will explore visualizing barriers to diversifying and democratizing the grain systems. So on that note, Phil, if you're ready to share your slides, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ruth and Hannah. Let me make sure I'm in full screen. Can everybody see the slides? Great. So thank you all for being here. As you know, trying to advance my slides here. There we go. As you know, the industrial food systems have a tendency to move away from diversity and towards uniformity. And this occurs for a number of attributes, both on the farm and off the farm. And I've highlighted ownership because that's what my research has focused on the most. But I'm also interested in understanding what is occurring in all of these other areas. And we know that uniformity can lead to some negative impacts. So just a few quick examples. Genetic uniformity was a key factor in outbreaks of corn blight in the United States, maize blight, and Canada in 1970, and also for avian influenza all over the world in recent years. And then geographic and ownership uniformity contributed to supply disruptions like we observed in the wake of COVID-19 outbreaks in processing plants. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to explore uniformity and diversity in the systems that supply us with grains and products that contain grains. And because these can be very complex, I'm only going to focus on 5 segments: bread, beer, milling, farming, and seeds. So I'm not going to have time to talk about distribution, retailing, international grain trade, although these are also affected by these trends. And most of my examples are going to be from the US and focus primarily on wheat and ownership. But I want you to keep this bigger picture in mind as I'm discussing these issues. So we have this dominant trend away from diversity, such as markets that are controlled by fewer and larger firms. But it's important to note that there's also resistance. There are counter trends towards diversity, sometimes filling in spaces left behind by those big firms. An interesting dynamic, however, is that some of the most successful efforts to increase diversity may end up being copied or even acquired by the dominant firms and unintentionally kind of reinforcing this dynamic. So here's an example. This is satire. This is from The Onion, which is omnigrain Cheerios made with every existing grain on earth. And this is real. This is what inspired it, which is Cheerios introduced plus ancient grains with Kamut brand Khorasan wheat and spelt along with quinoa. And then they were followed by Kellogg's Origins with the same 3 featured ingredients. And you might wonder if the motivation behind this was to support diversity and diversifying the food supply, or even just something like the health benefits of ancient grains. But fortunately, a marketing manager clarified this. And after criticism of the really high sugar content in this cereal, he said, the company simply wanted to capitalize on the ancient grains trend while also making the cereal taste good. So in other words, there weren't deeper values behind this move, which is not surprising. So let's look at these trends in more depth, starting with bread. And in the US, bread baking changed pretty dramatically beginning in the 1890s. At that time, about 90% of bread was homemade and made mostly by women. But by 1930, 90% of the bread came from factories and was made mostly by men. So in the 20s, a guy named William Ward started acquiring big bakeries, eventually formed 3 companies. Wonder Bread, Continental Baking Company was one of them. And he tried to merge them all together to just dominate the entire market. And the president of the US at that time, Coolidge, did not allow this. He would only allow a duopoly, not a monopoly. So 2 of the firms could combine, but not all 3. And today, with a much larger population, the situation is much different. Nearly half the bread sold in the United States is from just 2 firms. So in other words, we have like a Coke and Pepsi of bread. So these are the firms and their market shares, and the 4 firms combine for 58% of the market. And the store shelves, however, don't reflect how uniform this is, because there's an appearance of diversity. Both of those top 2 firms have dozens of brands, and I'll zoom in a little more so you can see. Bimbo Bakeries is Grupo Bimbo, a multinational firm headquartered in Mexico. They have more than 100 brands, 10,000 different products globally. And these are just some of their key bread brands in North America. And then Flowers Foods also has several dozen bread brands, along with snack brands like Tasty Cake and tortilla brands like Mi Casa. And then all of these bread brands. And then in third place, distant third place, is Campbell's Soup Company, which has one main brand, a Pepperidge Farm, which accounts for about 7.5% of bread sales. But it's important to note Campbell also has 6 different brands of Danish butter cookies. So they're doing this appearance of diversity as well. So how did these companies end up controlling so many brands? In part, it's been through acquisitions. So here's a timeline starting over 20 years ago, showing how more than 24 firms ended up being incorporated into Bimbo and Flowers. And just to give you an idea how complicated this is, Wonder Bread, referring back to that slide a few slides ago, it's owned by Flowers in the United States, but it's owned by Bimbo in Mexico and by George Weston in Canada. And bread is perishable, so there's a kind of a limit to the geographic uniformity that you can have, but there's still this trend towards fewer and larger bakeries. Bimbo has 70, Flowers has 44. After Bimbo acquired Sara Lee in 2012, they closed 18 plants and they've added just 2 cents. So we have fewer and larger bakeries. But as you know, there's this counter trend. There are small independent bakeries, including some that are opening up more recently and that support more diverse supply chains. So I try to make my own bread as much as possible, but when I don't have time to make bread, I get it from Stone Circle Bakehouse near me. And this is operated by Kevin Cosgrove, who's pictured here in front of his massive wood-fired oven. And in recent years, they've introduced loaves with einkorn wheat as an ingredient. So there are more and more efforts like this that are very hard to see. I mean, you really have to look at your local level to find efforts like this. So the next segment is beer. And I had this graphic on that earlier slide. So you can see just 4 firms control well over half the market. And this is globally. This is not just a national market. And this concentration ratio of over half the sales makes it very easy for these firms to raise prices. One firm just has to signal their intention to raise prices and the others will follow suit. And that's exactly what happened when the Belgian firm InBev acquired Anheuser-Busch in the United States. They announced they were raising prices. They were immediately matched by the second largest firm. And in the US, 4 firms control 77% of sales. And then a few years later, InBev raised prices again, they were matched. So we've had, this is just one of the impacts on consumers with this consolidation is increasing prices. And here's just part of the story of this trend. Just from the year 2000 to 2012, you can see how more than a dozen firms combined into just four. So those four firms that control half of beer sales were all headquartered in Northern Europe. And then a few years later in 2016, as you probably know, Anheuser-Busch InBev acquired SAB Miller for 69 billion pounds. That's over $100 million US. One of the biggest deals in history in terms of corporations combining. And it took a couple of years, but regulators around the world allowed this to go through with some minor concessions. So this shows ownership of beer brands in the United States. And I will zoom in on the key so you can see what those colors refer to. So yellow is big brewers and their non-craft brands. Blue is craft. And then orange is crafty or fake craft beers that these non-craft brewers introduce for a time. And then the green is private equity. And then zooming back out, you can see almost at a glance, if you look at those biggest yellow circles, the parent corporations, and then you look for the blue circles, nearly every non-craft brewery has acquired craft brands. And just to give you some examples, zooming in a little more toward the top right, you can see the 17 formerly independent craft breweries that Anheuser-Busch InBev acquired in the last decade or so, and also the 5 fake craft beer brands they offer. And then at the bottom left is the second largest brewer in the world, Heineken, which has fully acquired Lagunitas, a craft brewer, and then it has partial ownership of 7 more craft brewers. So some people suggest that it's maybe a good thing that big brewers are investing their resources in craft beer, but it's certainly not always positive. We saw this back in 2015 during the Super Bowl. AB InBev ran an ad for Budweiser. So this ad was viewed by more than 100 million people, and it mocked people who drink craft beer. It made fun of people who smell their beer and who drink varieties like a pumpkin peach ale. They called that example out specifically. What was really interesting is the ad ran just 1 week after they had acquired a brewery in the West Coast of US in Seattle, Washington, that makes a pumpkin peach ale. So one of the impacts was that Elysian Brewery was founded by 3 people. 2 of them wanted to sell to AB InBev, the other didn't, but he was outvoted. They all became executives at AB InBev. But the holdout, as soon as this ad ran, he said, clearly, this firm does not have commitment to the values of craft. I mean, if they're trying to undermine the category of craft beer, this is not a company I want to work for, and he resigned. And a few years ago, I wondered how this was playing out on the shelves where I live. So I went to 20 local retailers and I took an inventory of everything in the craft beer section, how much space it took, and then I decoded the ownership ties relative to the amount of space occupied. And I found that on average, nearly 40% of what I was seeing in the craft beer sections actually had ownership ties to the big brewers. And none of these ownership ties were identified in the packaging, the company websites or anything. So people may think that they're supporting an alternative with these purchases, and they're actually giving their money to the big brewers who end up running ads like that. So there is a response to this. One response has been the development of the Independent Craft Seal by the Brewers Association, which represents more than 9,000 breweries in the US, and they account for over 13% of the market. So those that meet the definition of an independent craft brewer, they don't even have to be a member of this association, are free to place this seal on their product packaging so that consumers can more easily identify which system they're supporting with their purchases. And there are over 5,000 breweries in the US now participating. So most of the world's largest food and beverage firms in beer, bread, and many other products are becoming involved in the organic industry. And here's the landscape in North America as of a few years ago. The largest processors are represented in yellow, and brown represents more than 100 formerly independent organic brands that have since been acquired since shortly before the USDA organic standard went into effect in 2002. And some of these include those bread firms that I was mentioning earlier. So for example, Bimbo Bakeries and Flowers Foods have been spending a lot of money to acquire organic brands, as much as $275 million to acquire just one brand. So there are counter trends here in organic as well. There are independent firms that have resisted enormous and frequent buyout offers, which is pretty remarkable because they're now competing against some of the biggest firms in the world that can, take money from other parts of their corporation and sell below cost for years or spend massive amounts on advertising. It's very difficult to compete against these big firms if they have an intention to drive out their competitors. And some of these independent brands you see here, actually most of them are really struggling like right now. It's a very difficult space to be in, but they're hanging on and maintaining their commitment to organic ideals and remaining independent. Another response to some of the perceptions that the national organic standards have been watered down, for example, allowing confinement, factory farms to be certified organic, and allowing hydroponic produce to be certified organic, which is, very few countries in the world allow that, but the US does now. So there are actually 2 new labels in recent years to help consumers identify foods that meet these USDA standards, but also go beyond them. They don't allow hydroponic to be certified, and they require much more access to pasture for livestock. And many of those independent processors that you saw in the last slide have been very supportive of these efforts. So the next segment is milling. And 150 years ago in the US, most mills look like this. In 1870, there were over 22,000 mills that were operated by wind or water power. But after the Civil War in the US, the ownership and geographic extent really concentrated. There were new technologies developed in Hungary that made flour less perishable and made it harder for these mills to stay in business. So the firms that are the precursors of General Mills, Pillsbury, and another Minneapolis firm, they dominated the industry by 1898. They had 24 mills, and they were described as a flour trust. But they began to lose a little bit of their power as wheat production increased in other parts of the country. In less than a decade, from 1980 to 1990, we saw the share of the top 4 flour mill firms increase more than 20%. This is a result of political changes in the US, the election of Ronald Reagan, who directed the heads of regulatory agencies to be much more permissive on antitrust regulations. Also, federal judges were being indoctrinated with the idea that mergers and acquisitions were almost always great for consumers, and it doesn't matter what their impacts are on producers or workers. So we had this big increase. And here's an example of 95% of North American milling industry capacity is controlled by just 48 companies and by just 170 mills. That's far less than that 22,000 from 150 years ago. And that doesn't even tell the full story, because just one firm, Ardent Mills, controls 34% of the capacity for US and Canada. So just 40 mills. And for some farmers, as a result of these changes, they may have no option but to sell to Ardent Mills. There's no one else to sell to. So Ardent Mills is actually a joint venture of 3 firms. So it includes Cargill, which is the largest privately held corporation in the US, and then publicly traded ConAgra, and then CHS, which is technically a farmer cooperative, but the executives now have a lot of power and don't always represent the best interest of their farmer members. And in second place in milling, we have ADM, Archer Daniels Midland, 17% of the capacity, 23 wheat flour mills. And decades ago, ADM became infamous because they were caught on recordings made by the FBI fixing prices and dividing up markets for feed additives like lysine and citric acid. So they would literally gather their three largest competitors in hotel rooms in Hawaii and Mexico City and just divide up the market and set prices. And they were caught on tape actually saying this company slogan, which is the customer is our enemy and the competitor is our friend. And another example, General Mills, with just one flour mill in Kansas City, it was linked to an outbreak of E. coli, pathogenic E. coli in 2016, and it ended up affecting more than 20 states. So when something goes wrong, when we have production so geographically concentrated, it can have a really big impact. So there's a counter trend, both in the U.S. and there in the U.K. Maintaining some of these historic mills and involving them in commercial production. So the state where I live, Michigan, there are 2 stone mills in operation right now, one of which is powered by wind. And we also have one operating water mill, but that's not a commercial operation. It's an all volunteer nonprofit, and they only operate once a week. And then the next segment is farming. And this map shows where wheat is grown globally, and I'll zoom in on that in a second. The chart shows the leading producers as of a few years ago. So at that time, European Union was in first place, followed by China, India, US, Russia, Canada. And as you know, wars and climate change are causing disruptions for many of these supplies now. And here's the darker the color, the more wheat is grown. So you can see where wheat is grown in Europe and Africa and Asia. And then on the other side, we have North America, and we go to the next map, which is the US. And here's another view where the darker the green in this case, the more wheat is grown. So back in 2012, there were 55 million acres planted in wheat. It's gone up a couple million since then. And the areas where it's darkest, you can see where it's most concentrated. What's grown is mostly hard red winter wheat. That accounts for about 40% of the crop in the US. And the exception is the Pacific Northwest, the concentrated areas there. They focus on soft white wheat. And in farming, we've also had this trend of fewer and larger farms, even though there are still quite a few farms growing wheat. So the blue bars here show the number of farms growing wheat in 1987 all the way to 2017. And you can see the decline from about 350,000 farms to just about 100,000 farms. And then the orange line is the acreage midpoint. So we've seen from about 400 acre average to well over 1,000 acre average during that period. And this shows that just 3,000 farms on the right side there, just 3,000 farms of 2,000 acres or more account for 22% of the harvest. And then, this is for 2012 when there were more farms, but 100,000 farms of less than 250 acres, they accounted for just 11% of the harvest. So you can see twice as much coming off 3,000 farms compared to 100,000 farms. And then in the middle, about 2/3 of the harvest is coming from about 40,000 farms that range in size from 250 to 2,000 acres. And then the last category I'll talk about is seeds. So on the left side, those are the 4 largest seed firms in the world. And this is an industry that's changed probably the most dramatically from what I've seen. The market share was less than 20% a few decades ago, held by the top 4 firms. Now it's over half of the seeds in the world are coming from these 4 firms. And then if you look to the right, the same figures for agrochemical sales, you'll notice it's the exact same 4 firms. So what's happened is chemical companies have been buying up seed companies. So this shows chemical companies in red, and then all of those blue circles are seed companies. And you can see this is the latest graphic I have. So from 1996 to 2022, hundreds and hundreds of seed companies have been acquired. So starting in the 1970s, what were once 30 different chemical companies have all combined and collapsed into, a few years ago, there were 6 of them. And then more recently, they combined again into just 4. So we have these 4 giant chemical companies that have become incredibly dominant in seeds. And not surprisingly, one impact has been higher prices. But we're also seeing impacts of less diversity and less innovation. So for example, in the US, maize, corn, soybeans, those prices just from 1997 at the beginning of this period to 2015 increased about 300%. And for cotton, it increased about 500%. And this is much, much faster than inflation and much higher than other agricultural inputs. So a really clear example of firms using their market power to increase prices. To give you an example of how diversity has declined, Monsanto, which is now owned by Bayer of Germany, from 2004 to 2007, they formed a holding company called American Seeds Incorporated. And they started buying up all these Midwestern maize and soybean firms to gain access to those seeds, to introduce their patented genetically engineered traits, and to steer farmers towards applying more of their herbicides. And in many cases, farmers, if they went to their seed dealer, went to the brand website, they would have no idea that Monsanto now owned these firms. And in the years since, they've actually abandoned many of these brands. These are just the ones that Monsanto acquired, but a total of 57 brands have been lost as a result of consolidation. And during this period, these firms were offering fewer and fewer options for farmers. One company, Tristler of Illinois, went from offering 33 different varieties of corn to just 3 in the years after it was acquired by Monsanto. So this, all of these circles, there are 30,000 circles there. That represents roughly how many varieties of wheat there are. And then you see at the bottom right, just 9 red circles. There are, according to some estimates, just 9 varieties of wheat planted on half the acreage in the US. I know that's definitely the case in Michigan, where I'm at. Just 9 varieties account for over half the acreage. So we've also seen declining genetic diversity over in recent years. There are some researchers who say genetic diversity narrowed quite a bit from 1930 to 1980 as the seed industry became more and more consolidated. By 1980, after corn blight, there was more concern about the impacts of this, and there's been a little bit of increasing diversity in some areas since then, but there's still a lot of cause for concern here. So, for example, there's been less and less investment in innovation very broadly. So these big firms are trying to develop blockbuster traits in just a few types of seeds, and primarily aimed at places where they're grown most extensively. So they're ignoring orphan crops, crops that they don't find very profitable, that are grown in places where they don't sell as much seed. So just one example is that when Dow acquired Cargill's North American seed division, they dismantled all their research efforts in the southern United States, which contributed to this impact where we have had yield gains in places where maize is most extensively grown, but most of the US has actually seen declines represented in red. And an enormous driver of these changes has been increasing intellectual property protections. So governments are continuing to put more and more restrictions on farmers and gardeners' ability to save and replant seeds. So here are some key changes in the US legislation, and then in italics, those are court decisions, which have just given these firms more and more power and made it harder and harder for smaller seed companies to survive. In 2013, the one at the bottom, that was a Supreme Court decision called Bowman versus Monsanto, which enforces contract provisions beyond the first sale. So what happened was a farmer went to his local grain elevator, bought some soybeans, planted them. He applied. He knew that there was a very good chance they would be resistant to Roundup, so he applied Roundup herbicide. He let Monsanto know what was happening, and even though he had never signed a seed contract with them, he lost and was forced to pay Monsanto a lot of money. And all of the leading chemical companies, chemical seed companies, as well as fertilizer and machinery companies are buying up startup firms in digital agriculture. So this idea that big data and high tech products like lasers and drones. So this raises a lot of concern that farmers will be locked into these proprietary platforms because these firms are now in control of so much data, and they make it very difficult to switch to another platform. And this isn't just encouraging more uniformity, making it harder to switch to alternatives. So one response to these trends is a safe seed pledge, which was developed by the Open Source Seed Initiative, which involved some seed breeders at the University of Wisconsin and then spread from there. And it challenges these government-enforced intellectual property protections, and it encourages people to use seeds any way they choose as long as they don't restrict others' ability to do so. And there's not a lot of teeth behind this. I mean, it's a pledge. There's not much they can do if a big firm decides to go against this pledge, but it is increasing awareness of alternative seed sources, as well as this key driver of concentrating power of the patents on living organisms. And there are now similar efforts in Germany, India, Ethiopia, and Kenya. And there are still some independent US seed companies, including a few large maize and soybean firms, but there's also a rapidly growing number of smaller firms that focus on organic production or improved nutrition and taste. And the logos here represent 60 that are currently partners in the Open Source Seed Initiative in the US. So to recap, I've discussed uniformity and diversity, particularly for ownership, in these 5 segments. And the industrial food system is, typically becoming more uniform in other attributes such as geography, varieties, and genes. But there are also, as I just touched on, some important counter trends. And although they're currently small, many are making progress in maintaining or even increasing diversity in key areas. And it's going to take many strategies and many more people to achieve success. But I would suggest that one promising strategy is the efforts that are helping to make these counter trends towards diversity and democracy more visible, such as through labels and certifications and pledges. And I'm hopeful that there will be many more of these and greater awareness of them in the future. And if you're interested in delving into these issues more, my website is philhoward.net. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Phil. Yeah, that's amazing, seeing all those graphs. It's quite hard to fathom until you see it all laid out. Yeah, quite scary, but good to know the real state of things. If anyone has questions, either you can put if you go to the bar on the bottom and where it says reactions, you can click on raise hand, and then it will just put you in a queue, and we can get you on to ask Phil. Or you can write into the chat and I will read it out, either way. So, Jay Hurst, you're muted, Karen. Sorry.
Hello, thanks, Phil. That was really interesting. It was good to see some of the kind of preconceptions around industrialized food production challenged in terms of yields and in terms of prices. That was really interesting. But I've kind of, I was linking back to George Monbiot's Regenesis sort of concept on yield with organic farming and against the backdrop of trying to feed the world, right? So a lot of those long-term trends, we have population growth, it's doubled, it's massive now compared to what it was 100 years ago. We've got the green revolution and industrialized farming, etc. So there's like surely some inevitable economies of scale that have to exist. And if we look at future population growth to 10, 11 billion, and we have climate change decimating yields, making it more difficult, how do we kind of square the circle of having more diversity and still feeding the world?
Yeah, I would point you towards a book called The Agricultural Dilemma by Glenn Davis Stone. The subtitle is How Not to Feed the World. And what you said, a lot of people accept, but Stone, starting with Malthus and going from there, points out that that argument is exactly backwards. We produce much more food in this world than everyone can eat. The problem is it's not distributed. It doesn't go where it needs to. And actually, governments have subsidized input industries, particularly fertilizer industries and now chemical and seed industries, to produce too much food. So it's a convenient argument to push the idea of yields, but we actually need to take a step back and say, we don't lack for food in the US, and the pushing yields has led to these crazy situations like in the US where we're taking corn that's not going to humans, it's not even going to livestock, it's going into our fuel tanks because governments are trying to figure out what to do with these stockpiles of corn. So they're saying, even though it's not energy efficient, we're going to burn this corn. So we need to take a step back and look at industrial food systems that overemphasize yields. And Stone points out that we don't actually, it's not very sociologically or anthropologically astute to claim that increasing food leads to population growth. It's actually the opposite. So I'm encouraging everyone to read that book, or at least some of his shorter articles that summarize it.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. What was that book again? I'll give it a read.
The Agricultural Dilemma, How Not to Feed the World by Glenn Davis Stone.
Okay, thank you. And sorry, let a follow up then. So do you think we could feed the world if we all went organic? Or is there somewhere in between where it's kind of big scale, but it's more diverse?
Yeah, I think that transition is going to be difficult. I don't think you can just flip a switch and stop using some of these inputs because the soils have been degraded. They require fertilizer. You can't just stop using fertilizer. But I do think that there's enormous potential to apply the science of agroecology and have not only sufficient food for everyone, but food that is much more nutritious and more democratic.
Okay, top stuff. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I just wanted to quickly add a few bits more information if you were interested in reading up on that. From a small Sheffield wheat experiment point of view, one of the big starting points was asking some local farmers about that very question. We asked everyone about what is this myth, and a lot of the stuff around food waste came from that, and land grabs, and actually how many small-scale female farmers there are still feeding the world is huge. But so I think, you can also look at classics, people like Vandana Shiva, who dig into this kind of what the alternative actually could be, but also what's also going on, what's the narratives behind this idea that we can't feed the world without industrializing it and chemicalizing the food. So go on to the back end of our website, but also follow some links there.
Carol, would you like to ask a question?
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, two things. One, a comment on the comment about how do we feed the world and stuff. And I think most of the stuff looking at sort of sustainable diets and stuff is about we could feed the world if we had a stronger shift towards plant-based diets. But that was just a comment. That wasn't my question. My question is about GM crops and how the European Union's kind of move and, restriction about not having GM crops in Europe. Does that match up with less consolidation within the seed industry? Because there isn't so much, and that linkage between the seed industry and the agricultural chemical industry, because without GM crops, then that linkage isn't there, and also the whole kind of patenting and hybridness isn't there. So it is more possible to have, to accept a degree of diversity in the seed stock.
Yeah, I believe there's a little bit more ownership diversity in terms of fruit and vegetable production, fruit and vegetable seed sales in the EU, and those fewer, that full patent protection on genetically engineered seeds, unfortunately, is being extended to all types of seeds. So that tight linkage is being dismantled, so that kind of barrier to consolidation is being removed. So the 2 of the 4 largest seed firms in the world, 2 are headquartered in Germany now. So and they're continuing to acquire more and more firms. So certainly rolling back patents on living organisms would go a long way to reducing the power of these firms. But even in the European Union, even without the widespread adoption of genetically engineered traits, there is still a lot of other ways these firms have been able to consolidate their power.
Oh dear. Okay, I thought there might be a sort of a slightly sunny side to the story, and something that we could argue for protecting, obviously with Britain and Brexit and things being dismantled, about what are some of the good things that we would seek to keep. Anyway, okay, thank you very much. Really interesting. Enjoyed your graphics.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you.
It might be worth trying to add a positive element around wheat legislation in the UK. It might not happen, but currently DEFRA are undertaking, or just about to undertake, a marketing trial in the UK to look at allowing heterogeneous material seed to be marketed. And by marketed, we mean sell and share and distribute. So that's the kind of population wheats that the Sheffield wheat experiment are growing. This was already, marketing trial was already happening in Europe with Martin Wolf's YQ wheat, and that was all going ahead and happening. But then Brexit happened, and we didn't take that legislation with us. But as of next month, I think a new trial period is happening in the UK to look at if how that can be managed.
Yeah, and another example in the EU, there was a successful campaign to end those really restrictive seed registries for organic producers. And actually, there were some big supermarket chains that were supportive of that because they were unable to, sell produce that farmers were growing because it wasn't, allowed on those restrictive seed registries. So there are more spaces for those really small organic seed firms or for farmers to at least be more self-reliant on their seeds.
I have a comment. I just so my background's in public health nutrition, but I started off in agricultural botany, so I've been a long way. It's still about food. It's still about plants. I think it's kind of interesting that in the medical world, we've really moved over to this idea about personalized medicine and how, the medicine and the treatments you get must be personalized and matching your genome. Yet in the kind of agricultural production phase, we've got everything, of real kind of one size fits all, irrespective of the geography, the climate, the kind of the micro thing. So I just sort of see how there is a kind of a divergent track of health and medicine and sort of plant-based food production, yet they're all about the same, they're all about keeping humans fed and healthy. So just a comment kind of as a kind of observer coming from a different, slightly different background. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what you think, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more research on. Well, it reminds me, there's a really interesting book by an animal scientist named Fred Provenza called Nourish. And he's an advocate for much more diverse food systems. And he's observed in, livestock, they have this innate sense of knowing what is needed. But, he talks about our industrial food system doesn't allow us to seek out that diversity and really personalize what we need to consume.
Phil, just another quick one as it occurs to me. You mentioned sort of like consumer-based measures that might help like increase labeling and we can make a consumer choice about what we buy. On the other side, what would be your sort of, top wish list for addressing things from a regulatory point of view? Is it possible to kind of break up some of these monopolies or roll back some of the restrictions they've got? How do you kind of break that down again?
Yeah, I think some promising directions are, roll back those intellectual property restrictions on living organisms, particularly those full patent protections, reinvigorate antitrust enforcement. I think there are more and more people who are questioning the ideology that, many governments around the world have subscribed to in terms of looking at consumer welfare and only theoretically, not looking at the actual impacts. So that's another area. And then just dismantling the subsidies that these huge firms have. They have so many direct and indirect subsidies that create barriers to smaller firms and alternatives that I think that's going to be more effective than trying to craft a, let's say, there's a lot of well-intended legislation that can very easily be redirected by industry lobbying. So taking away the subsidies, I think, it gets more to the root of the problem than trying to address the consequences that they're creating later on.
Yeah, Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting.
Phil, could you, it was really interesting when you started talking about the craft beer being crafty. And I, at that point, this was kind of the wheat story. So I was just thinking, oh gosh, what would it be for the seed companies if there was some kind of trend enough to make heterogeneous material or chemical input seeds popular enough to be sparking their interest again? You know, how could that look? How would they co-opt the heterogeneous material? But then it just, by the time you finished your talk, it was just like, it's so not on that scale. It doesn't seem like there was any interest. So it's just steamrolling with the chemical kind of seed control approach. But could you imagine a time where, if there is enough legislative change and enough squeeze on bigger companies through the ways you've just stated, how could you imagine these companies craftying heterogeneous material of cereals and things like that?
Yeah, I think it would be similar to the General Mills and Kellogg, you know, starting to source kamut, Khorasan wheat, and quinoa, and you know, there's, you know, interest from a lot of brewers in perennial wheat, for example, particularly in the U.S. in the area of Minnesota. So there are breweries that are using perennial wheat and promoting that it's, you know, in the product, but it's not you know, unfathomable that a company like Carlsberg would start, you know, using perennial wheat in their products. You know, the #3 brewer in the world. So you know, as long as there's a way to co-opt something and steer it back towards reinforcing their power, they're going to do that, unless those barriers are built in. You know, like with some of these new organic plus certifications, making it impossible to factory farm livestock. You know, that's going to keep the bigger firms out.
Okay, Hannah, we're on 9 o'clock exactly. Do you think, should we check any more questions and then wrap up?
Yeah. Any last questions from anyone? I think that's probably it.
Okay. A huge thank you, Phil, for shedding slightly depressing but also very important story. In a way, I think it once you've kind of got over the shock of these things, it solidifies everything enough to give you hopefully some energy to put sort of deeper purpose and value in the choices that you make or the actions that you do, despite what you think the results are going to be. It's just kind of living by the actions. And I think that's one of the important things about the project that we're trying to do, is just, it's not really trying to go big or make big changes like that, but it's just important to do something counter to that story. So very much appreciate you giving your time, and we'll share the link for your website in our email and future correspondence as well, so people can, I guess, see quite a lot of that information on your website.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. And I just want to emphasize that, you know, these trends are always resisted, even though it's hidden. So I actually am very hopeful that they will not continue forever.
Thanks, Bill. And thank you for everyone for giving up your Wednesday evening. And we will be in touch, for growers who are part of the Wheat Experiment. We'll be in touch with more newsletters soon. Okay. Thank you for coming.